At that moment, Sugar Ray Robinson could have done the easiest thing. He could have gone home, turned off the lights, protected what made him unbeatable. But instead, he chose to stay where the applause was louder than doubt. And that decision didn't destroy him instantly. It did something far more dangerous. It slowly changed what greatness meant to him. If this moment feels uncomfortably familiar, stay with this story. He understood it before he admitted it. He shouldn't have been there. Not because it was forbidden, not because anyone warned him, but because certain places quietly take something from you while smiling at your face. The room looked safe. Warm light softened the corners. Music moved slowly, confident it would not be interrupted. Laughter flowed without tension, without stakes. People leaned closer than necessary, not to hear him better, but to feel included in his presence. Sugar Ray Robinson stood among them without effort. He didn't need to announce himself. The room adjusted automatically. Heads turned, conversations bent. Even pauses seemed to wait for him. In the gym, attention was something you fought for with pain and repetition. Here, it arrived complete and unconditional. No one asked how his legs felt when he woke up. No one asked if his hands were heavy or his breath shorter than usual. No one noticed the slight stiffness when he shifted his weight. They weren't here for the fighter who survived on discipline and restraint. They were here for the name, the smile, the idea of greatness that required no explanation. Every handshake felt like agreement. Every laugh felt like approval. This wasn't respect earned through sacrifice. This was admiration that asked nothing back. Outside these walls existed another rhythm. Early mornings that offered no comfort. Empty rooms where only mirrors watched. Routines that demanded everything and praised nothing. That world sharpened him, but it never embraced him. This one embraced him immediately. People told him he had earned this. They reminded him how much he had already proven. One night, they said, just one. And nothing inside him pushed hard enough to leave. That was the danger. Greatness doesn't vanish when something goes wrong. It erodes when nothing does. He felt how natural it was to stay. How easy it became to delay the quiet work waiting elsewhere. Discipline, once a shield, began to feel like a restriction. Applause filled the space where focus used to live. Noise replaced the voice that kept him precise. The crowd didn't know what it was taking from him, and he didn't yet recognize what he was surrendering. Not power, not skill, not reputation. Something smaller and more fragile. Urgency, the instinct to protect the edge that separated him from everyone else. That night didn't steal a fight from him. It stole the habit of choosing the harder room. And once that habit weakens, everything else starts to bargain. If you've ever stayed where comfort was louder than discipline, don't leave this story yet. He told himself it was temporary, a phase, something that would pass once the noise settled. But silence had started to feel heavier than exhaustion. When the room emptied and the lights dimmed, something restless followed him home. The quiet didn't soothe him anymore. It questioned him. In the dark, without faces and hands and laughter, there was nothing to distract from the small calculations running through his head. Was he still sharp? Was the edge still there? Did it fade gradually or did it vanish all at once? He used to welcome these hours. They were where discipline lived. Now they felt exposed. The mornings came slower. The body still responded, but not with the same hunger. Repetition began to feel mechanical instead of necessary. He noticed how quickly his mind searched for interruption. Conversation, errands, anything to shorten the time alone. Sugar Ray Robinson had always been surrounded by people, but once, solitude never scared him. It sharpened him. It clarified what mattered. Now it pressed in from all sides. In the gym, the sound of the bag felt louder than before, not because it hit harder, but because it echoed longer. Between rounds, the pauses stretched. He filled them with chatter, with jokes, with stories that didn't need to be told. His team noticed the shift before he did, not in missed punches or slower feet, but in attention. He listened differently, half present, as if some part of him was still elsewhere, replaying applause that no longer existed. They spoke to him about rest, about focus, about protecting the routine. He nodded. He agreed. He always agreed. But agreement is easy when it asks nothing immediately. The truth sat underneath all of it. Being alone required him to face expectations without witnesses. In public rooms, greatness was assumed. In quiet ones, it had to be proven again and again. That proof demanded patience, and patience had begun to feel like absence. He didn't stop training. He didn't stop caring. He just started negotiating. Shorter sessions, later mornings, small compromises that felt reasonable in isolation. The danger wasn't collapse. It was drift. He wasn't running from work. He was drifting toward noise. And the more he filled his time, the less space remained for doubt, and for the discipline that doubt once fueled. Silence no longer felt like a tool. It felt like judgment. And when a man starts avoiding silence, he starts losing the place where he measures himself honestly. If you've ever filled the quiet just to avoid what it was asking, stay with this story. No one forced it on him. That was the most convincing part. The pressure didn't arrive as an order or a threat. It came wrapped in smiles, in opportunities, in people who spoke softly and never said no. They liked him best this way, present, generous, available. When he lingered, rooms felt important. When he showed up late, no one complained. When training bent around his schedule, they adjusted without resistance. It looked like support. It felt like loyalty. But underneath it was convenience. His distraction made everything easier for everyone else. Promoters didn't have to wait. Friends didn't have to compete with the gym. Nights stretched longer, and no one reminded him of mornings. Sugar Ray Robinson had always been valuable, but now his value came without friction. That was new. In the past, access to him was earned through discipline, his and theirs. Now it was granted through proximity. People told him how good it was to see him relaxed. They said he deserved to enjoy what he'd built. They spoke about balance, about living a little. None of them were wrong. They were just incomplete. Every invitation pulled him slightly away from the routines that asked the most of him. Every yes made the next one easier. No one benefited from him being exhausted in an empty gym at dawn. Plenty benefited from him being visible at night. And because the cost wasn't immediate, it felt imaginary. In the gym, consequences were clear. Miss a session, feel it in your body. Lose focus, get punished. Outside, there was no feedback loop. Only reassurance. When doubts surfaced, someone was always ready to quiet them. When fatigue appeared, rest was suggested in the wrong direction. The system around him didn't need him weaker. It just needed him accessible. And accessibility erodes edges faster than opposition ever could. He wasn't being used maliciously. He was being accommodated. That was worse. Accommodation allowed him to believe nothing was wrong. The more distracted he became, the more comfortable everyone else felt. Advice softened. Expectations lowered quietly. No one said, "You're slipping." They said, "You're fine." And fine is dangerous when you've lived at the extreme. He still hit the bag, still ran, still showed up. But the urgency had shifted from inside to outside. Instead of protecting the work, he protected the schedule around it. He told himself this was control. In reality, control had started moving away from him. Not taken, given. One small adjustment at a time, by people who smiled, clapped, and never asked him to leave early. The distraction didn't weaken him overnight. It insulated him. And insulation is what keeps warning signs from reaching the surface until it's too late. If you've ever been supported in ways that quietly pulled you off course, stay with this story. No one forced it on him. That was the most convincing part. The pressure didn't arrive as an order or a threat. It came wrapped in smiles, in opportunities, in people who spoke softly and never said no. They liked him best this way, present, generous, available. When he lingered, rooms felt important. When he showed up late, no one complained. When training bent around his schedule, they adjusted without resistance. It looked like support. It felt like loyalty. But underneath it was convenience. His distraction made everything easier for everyone else. Promoters didn't have to wait. Friends didn't have to compete with the gym. Nights stretched longer, and no one reminded him of mornings. Sugar Ray Robinson had always been valuable, but now his value came without friction. That was new. In the past, access to him was earned through discipline, his and theirs. Now it was granted through proximity. People told him how good it was to see him relaxed. They said he deserved to enjoy what he'd built. They spoke about balance, about living a little. None of them were wrong. They were just incomplete. Every invitation pulled him slightly away from the routines that asked the most of him. Every yes made the next one easier. No one benefited from him being exhausted in an empty gym at dawn. Plenty benefited from him being visible at night. And because the cost wasn't immediate, it felt imaginary. In the gym, consequences were clear. Miss a session, feel it in your body. Lose focus, get punished. Outside, there was no feedback loop, only reassurance. When doubts surfaced, someone was always ready to quiet them. When fatigue appeared, rest was suggested in the wrong direction. The system around him didn't need him weaker. It just needed him accessible. And accessibility erodes edges faster than opposition ever could. He wasn't being used maliciously. He was being accommodated. That was worse. Accommodation allowed him to believe nothing was wrong. The more distracted he became, the more comfortable everyone else felt. Advice softened. Expectations lowered quietly. No one said, "You're slipping." They said, "You're fine." And fine is dangerous when you've lived at the extreme. He still hit the bag, still ran, still showed up. But the urgency had shifted from inside to outside. Instead of protecting the work, he protected the schedule around it. He told himself this was control. In reality, control had started moving away from him. Not taken, given. One small adjustment at a time, by people who smiled, clapped, and never asked him to leave early. The distraction didn't weaken him overnight. It insulated him. And insulation is what keeps warning signs from reaching the surface until it's too late. If you've ever been supported in ways that quietly pulled you off course, stay with this story. There was still a way out, not a dramatic one. No confrontation, no announcement. Just a quiet exit that only required him to listen to the part of himself he'd been postponing. It appeared in small moments. An early morning when the gym was empty. A rare stretch of silence when no one needed anything from him. A look in the mirror that lingered half a second longer than usual. These moments didn't accuse him. They invited him back. Sugar Ray Robinson felt them, clearly enough to recognize what they were. This was the last point where choosing differently wouldn't cost him anything publicly. No reputation would suffer. No one would be disappointed. He could still tighten the routine, disappear for a while, let discipline retake its place without explanation. That's how it always worked, until it didn't. But the exit required something he had slowly lost comfort with: withdrawal, leaving rooms before the night peaked, saying no without replacing it with an excuse, sitting alone long enough for discomfort to settle instead of chasing it away. The problem wasn't temptation. It was momentum. His life now moved outward. Every day added another commitment, another expectation, another reason to stay visible. The quieter path felt almost irresponsible by comparison. People counted on him being present. Schedules bent around his availability. Absence would be noticed now. He told himself he'd do it after the next event, after the next obligation, after things slowed down. That's how the exit closed, not with a door, but with delay. Each postponed decision made the next one heavier. In the gym, he still worked, but the work no longer felt like refuge. It felt like interruption. He caught himself watching the clock, thinking ahead instead of inside the moment. That had never happened before. The edge he once protected now asked him to choose it again, and choosing it meant letting something else fade. Comfort, approval, the feeling of being wanted everywhere. He stood at that crossing more than once. Each time he told himself he wasn't choosing against discipline, just not choosing it yet. But not choosing is still a choice. And every time he stayed, the exit moved farther away, quieter, harder to recognize. The last chance to leave unnoticed doesn't announce itself. It simply waits, patient. And once it's ignored enough times, it stops waiting. It becomes history. He didn't know that yet. He only knew it felt easier to stay one more night, easier to postpone the harder room, easier to believe there would always be another moment to return. And that belief, more than any mistake, sealed the path ahead. If you've ever delayed the quiet decision because it asked too much, stay with this story. By the time it arrived, it didn't announce itself as a crossroads. There was no dramatic pause, no moment where the world seemed to wait for his answer. It felt ordinary, almost procedural, a schedule conflict, a body that felt a little slower than usual, a room that expected him to stay, the kind of situation he had navigated 100 times before. That was what made it dangerous. Sugar Ray Robinson didn't wake up that day thinking he was about to decide anything important. He thought he was managing, balancing, doing what was necessary. The language mattered. Choice implies clarity. This felt like maintenance. The gym was there. The routine was there. But so was everything else. People, obligations, noise that felt urgent simply because it was loud. He told himself he could do both, that he always had, that this wasn't the day discipline disappeared, just the day it adjusted. He noticed the calculation running quietly in his head. How much could be skipped without consequences? How much focus could be delayed without loss? These weren't questions he used to ask. They used to answer themselves. Now they negotiated. When he chose to stay visible instead of withdrawing, it didn't feel like betrayal. It felt reasonable. When he shortened the work instead of deepening it, it felt efficient. The choice didn't arrive as fame or discipline. It arrived as comfort or discomfort, ease or resistance, presence or absence. And comfort had been winning those battles for a while. The moment passed without ceremony. No one noticed. No one reacted. That was the point. The world didn't change. Only the internal standard shifted. He still believed he was in control. That belief was the last thing to go. Because once a man believes he's choosing freely, he stops questioning where the momentum is coming from. He didn't feel like he'd stepped away from greatness. He felt like he'd postponed it. And postponement is how people convince themselves nothing has been lost yet. The truth was quieter. This was the moment the harder option stopped feeling mandatory. Not because he couldn't do it, but because he no longer felt he had to. That's the choice that doesn't announce itself. The one that feels like relief instead of sacrifice. And once relief replaces discipline, the transformation is already underway. Not visible, not dramatic, just real. If you've ever chosen relief because resistance stopped feeling necessary, stay with this story. The silence returned differently this time. Not as an enemy, not as something to escape, but as a delayed consequence. It arrived after the rooms emptied, after the laughter dissolved, after the last familiar voice stopped calling his name. What remained wasn't peace. It was space. Too much of it. Sugar Ray Robinson sat with that space longer than he wanted to. The noise had always protected him from moments like this. Now it was gone. And without it, there was nothing to soften the realization that something had shifted. Not broken. Shifted. The body still responded. The skills were still there. But the urgency felt different, as if it had been relocated rather than removed. He replayed recent days in fragments. Not mistakes, not failures, just patterns. Delays that had become normal. Focus that arrived later than it used to. The quiet question wasn't, what went wrong? It was, When did this start feeling acceptable? That question lingered. In the gym, the next session felt heavier. Not physically, mentally. The work demanded something he hadn't fully brought with him. He could still perform. That was the cruel part. Performance covered the gap. It always does at first. Applause hadn't lied to him. It had just arrived too early. He realized how much of himself had been spent managing perception instead of protecting preparation. How often he'd chosen to be seen instead of being ready. None of it felt dramatic enough to regret yet. That's how the cost hides. It waits until comparison appears, until effort no longer produces the same return, until confidence has to speak louder to cover a quieter foundation. That night, without witnesses, he understood something he hadn't allowed himself to name before. Discipline doesn't disappear when you abandon it. It waits, and when you return, it charges interest. The silence wasn't punishing him. It was reminding him of standards he once enforced without negotiation, of edges he once guarded instinctively. He wasn't past the point of no return, but he was past the point of pretending nothing had changed. That realization didn't break him. It unsettled him, because it meant the next step wouldn't be accidental. It would be intentional, either toward reclaiming the harder room or toward fully accepting the easier one. The applause was gone now, and without it, there was no distraction left. Only the question he'd avoided asking while it still felt optional. If you've ever faced the silence after realizing comfort already changed you, stay with this story. The world never announced the change. There was no headline, no sudden rejection, no moment where everything collapsed at once. From the outside, he was still the same man, the same name, the same presence. Applause still came when he entered rooms. Respect still followed him into conversations. That was the illusion. Sugar Ray Robinson learned that the real cost of greatness is rarely collected in public. It's collected in private, when no one is there to argue with your standards. The hardest part wasn't losing anything obvious. It was realizing how much effort it took to get back to a level he once lived in naturally. Discipline now demanded negotiation. Focus required preparation. Silence felt heavier because it no longer obeyed him automatically. He understood then what had actually happened. He hadn't chosen fame over discipline once. He had chosen comfort over discomfort repeatedly until discipline stopped feeling like home. Greatness, he realized, isn't built on singular sacrifices. It's built on the refusal to make small, comfortable trades when no one is forcing your hand. He could still reclaim it. That was the cruel mercy of it all. Nothing was irreversibly lost. But reclaiming meant paying a different price now. Longer nights alone. Sharper honesty. The humility of rebuilding urgency without applause. The work would feel harder not because he was weaker, but because he was older to the illusion that effort is optional once you've proven yourself. That illusion is what greatness punishes the most. In the end, this wasn't about boxing, or fame, or even discipline. It was about the quiet agreement a man makes with himself when no one is watching, about whether he protects the standard that built him or replaces it with the comfort that congratulates him too early. The world didn't take anything from him. He gave it, gradually, willingly, in moments that felt harmless. And that's the truth most people never want to hear. We don't fall because we choose wrong once. We drift because we stop choosing at all. This story isn't about Sugar Ray Robinson. It's about the rooms we stay in too long, the exits we ignore because they're quiet, and the version of ourselves that waits patiently in silence, hoping we remember why we built it in the first place. If this story felt less like history and more like a mirror, carry it with you.